It's Jianghu Hustle.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Jianghu Hustle. I'm here with my co-host Eric Farmer.
And I'm here with my co-host, Eli Kurtz.
Today it's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! And Ip Man 3.
Oh, man, what a film. I think this one is definitely, it ranks up there with the first one in terms of how much I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's hard for me to find a favorite because there are so many moments across all three of the films we've seen so far that I enjoy. But I agree with you. I liked 3 better than 2, and 1 holds an undeniably special place in my heart.
I think we'll get into this, but I think that 1 is probably the best story, but I think Ip Man 3's individual moments just really elevate it.
Yeah.
But before we get into this, just a heads up, we have our usual content warnings of, violence and all of that kind of stuff, but also death by cancer. But before we get into talking about the movie, why don't we thank our patrons?
That's right. Yeah, we've got our Patreon account up and running. We have recently switched from a monthly model to a per episode model because with all of the stuff that's going on in the world and the important fights that we have to participate in there, we are no longer all that certain that we're going to be able to put out an episode once a month, and we don't want to charge our patrons for a month that we didn't give them something to listen to. So if you want, you can head over to Patreon/Jianghu Hustle and join our efforts to create a nest egg for our game design work, which has been continuing quite a bit all over the summer. And if not, we'd love to have your listenership anyway. We'd love to hear from you, even if you don't give us a dime. But for the people who do give us a dime, we owe you our thanks. So with no more ado, J. David Chrisman, Lilith Penrod, Craig, Andrew Dacey, David Millions, Kevin Lovecraft, Eric Bonts, Andreas DeVore, John Cole, Gallant Night Games, Anders Gabrielson, Derek Smith, Leonard Murphy, Dave, Jared Rasher, Fraser Ronald, Brian Kurtz, Jeremy Marr, Liam Murray, Sean Nicholson, Jason Detman, Lowell Francis, Rob Abrazado, PK, and Misdirected Mark Productions. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you so much. Lets us do all of our secret plans. And I hope everyone is out there doing well. And we really appreciate it.
All right, so let's get into this movie. All right, so Ip Man 3 came out in 2015, directed by Wilson Yip, same as the previous 2, written by Edmund Wong, Chan Tai Lee, and Jill Leung, cinematography by Kenny Se, and the action director is credited as Yuen Woo-ping, who we know from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, The Matrix, a ton of movies. But in interviews, interestingly enough, both Yuen Woo-ping and Donnie Yen have acknowledged that many of the fight scenes were choreographed by Donnie Yen in the moment, improvising on set. So pretty cool facts there.
What a guy.
What a guy.
Speaking of all of the people in the movie, the cast, Donnie Yen as Ip Man, Lin Hung as Chung Wing Sing, Zhang Jin as Chung Tin Chi, Kent Chung as Sergeant Poe, Mike Tyson as Frank, Patrick Tam as Ma King Sang.
Yeah, that's right. So here's how it goes. In 1959, Ip Man's Wing Chun School is the most quietly prestigious in Hong Kong. His eldest son has left home, so Ip Man and Wing Sing live comfortably with their youngest son, Ip Ching. When Ching gets into a schoolyard fight with a classmate, we learn the classmate's dad is a poor rickshaw driver who also happens to be a Wing Chun master named Chung Tin Chi.
We learn that a Western boxer named Frank runs a fighting ring in an industrial part of the city and wants to buy the land where Ip Ching's school is built. Again and again, Frank's gang pressures the school principal to sell until Ip Man's Wing Chun School volunteers to act as security until the gang loses interest. Frank's second in command, a local triad leader named Song, can do almost anything he wants because Frank is in league with the Western police chief, who always looks the other way.
Eventually, Song pushes too hard and kidnaps both Ip Man and Chung Tin Chi's sons. After a valiant rescue, Frank ousts Song and hires a Muay Thai fighter to attack Ip Man. This is terrible timing because Wing Sing has just learned she has ovarian cancer, and Ip Man has started to ignore the martial world to support his dying wife. The TIE fighter attacks them both in an elevator, and Ip Man makes quick work of him, then goes to fight Frank. After a 3-minute fight that ends in a close standstill, Frank agrees to stay out of Ip Man's life.
Meanwhile, Chung Tin Chi does some dirty work for the Triads to get seed money to start a school. As soon as the school opens, he starts challenging the other masters to earn the prestige needed to challenge Ip Man as the top representative of the Wing Chun style. Ip Man pays no attention as he focuses on some final happy moments with Wing Sing, and Chung Tin Chi is declared representative by default. Eventually, she urges Ip Man to answer the challenge before she dies.
So Ip Man and Chung Tin Chi fight with poles, butterfly knives, and hand-to-hand, and then Ip Man narrowly wins with a 1-inch punch. Chun Tin Chi concedes the title of Grandmaster back to Ip Man, who says in response that the most important thing in life is to spend time with the people you love. In the epilogue, we learn that Wing Sing passes away just months afterward.
Oh, Wing Sing, you deserve
Ugh,
better.
she deserved better throughout this entire series, and it's such a bummer to me that Ip Man never gave her the time and attention that she deserved until she was dying.
Right, right.
Man,
Oh, it's rough.
I
It was
know.
a rough watch. There's some tears shed at
Oh, for
like
sure,
for
me
real.
too. Yeah,
So,
it was
uh,
really moving. And like we've throughout this entire series where we've been talking about these movies from the very beginning, Wing Sing has been a treasure that we have praised, right? And then to see her go out like this, it just kills me. Oh,
yeah, yeah, it's rough. It's one of those things that because of the sort of historicity of the movie, we are following Ip Man, and at some point, his actual wife did die, and so that has to be in the story. But there were a lot of places in this movie where you could see the story kind of like anything that didn't focus on Ip Man just sort of like faded away. And Wing Sing, unfortunately, was in that category, like in almost every movie.
right, right. And it's a shame that when she gets proper attention, it's here for these
Hmm.
reasons. But like you said, yeah, we were talking a little bit before we started recording. There are a lot of threads in this movie that are just kind of dropped. Song is one of them, the triad leader. He just sort of disappears and there's no follow up or anything about him. There are a few other things like that too, where you're kind of like, oh, well, what happened there? But I think the rest of the movie is so good that it more or less makes up for it.
Yeah, the moments in this movie make up for the fact that as a whole, it doesn't feel necessarily like a complete story. It feels sort of in parts, but we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say before we get into some of our research, the thing that I appreciate about this movie more than the previous movies is that the previous movies, the martial arts was really brutal and people were beaten to death several times in both of the movies, right?
Hmm.
In this movie, it almost seems a little more fantastic and playful. You still see people getting severe beatings, but it's not presented in as visceral a way as the previous movies did with some things. And it's not like a life or death stakes situation this time around. It's just it's much more of a friendly rivalry instead.
It's definitely more of that martial world sort of ranking that we see in some of the other films that we've watched.
Hmm.
And definitely there are some like in the fight with Mike Tyson. It's agreed 3-minute fight. If you're still standing at the end, I'll leave you alone.
Right. And even though he's sort of this unscrupulous criminal who's willing to do things that require the police to look the other way, he still is totally going to abide by the rules he established for this fight.
Right. So, yeah, I think that's interesting. Though we do see Chung Tin Chi use a level of violence in some of these challenges with the Masters
Hmm.
that is
Yeah.
probably more than needs to be, but I think it's expressing his character.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we mention that he got his money to open the school by doing some dirty work for the triads. And the biggest moment of that is when he goes and he fights Song's old master, who disrespected Song in front of all of Song's gangsters. And Chung Tin Chi ends up breaking this master's arm. But that is, in a lot of ways, the harshest physical consequence that anybody in any of the named characters in the movie face.
Right, right. I just kind of want to get this out of the way, but Bruce Lee is back in the movie in a couple of spots,
Uh-huh.
and man, I know that Ip Man trained Bruce Lee, but like these parts could have been cut out of the movie, and it would not have mattered.
Right.
Uh,
I was of the opinion whenever he first showed up, I was like, oh, cool. Is this going to be kind of like, is Bruce Lee going to be a secondary character in this movie? And are we going to sort of see this relationship start to grow? No, no, we're not.
no,
It
we're not. Yeah,
not much more screen time than the pugnacious little kid from the end of the second one.
yeah. Like at least that one was sort of tacked on to the end. This one is like at the very beginning, and then about 2/3 of the way through, he shows up again,
Yeah.
and it's it's just a caricature of Bruce Lee, and it feels like fan service,
Yeah.
and I just didn't think it added anything to the movie.
I'm getting kind of into speculative territory here just to make sure everybody knows ahead of time, but I seem to remember that a lot of Hong Kong and Chinese martial artists were really cool on the notion of Bruce Lee going over to the West and teaching Westerners how to fight
Hmm.
because the traditions were supposed to be kept a little more closely than that. And it's interesting to see him in this movie. It almost feels like the filmmakers aren't totally sure what to do with him. And and it seems like they acknowledge, oh well, he's a big superstar, historical figure at this point in real life. And so
Hmm.
we should include something about him in the movie, but they don't seem to invest a whole lot of time or even care into that presence in the movie. And I wonder how much that plays into historical and current feelings about him and his legacy within Hong
Sure.
Kong.
Yeah, I mean, especially because at that point in his life, he wasn't like the best dude.
Right, right.
So it's a really like kind of fraught subject all around, culturally and representation wise of the actual person. Um, but also, like we were saying before, the movie's not about him; it's about Ip Man.
Right. And he serves his purpose in so much as we get our little fan service thing. But I think your point here is that fan service often is not really necessary.
It's distracting, and it reminded me of Rogue One, where at the beginning we have the two guys from the cantina kind of show up, and you're like, "Oh, that's cute." Like
Oh, yeah.
we could have not had this, and it would have been better. And I don't feel like it was that egregious, but I think just in terms of storytelling and in terms of drama, just reminds you that you're watching a movie.
Yeah. It sort of breaks the artifice of it.
But let's move on from that because I thought this movie, I said it up top, but it was less, it had definitely a defined act structure, but also it wasn't as much of like a start to finish story as some of the other films were. It definitely felt like it had episodes in it, and that it was kind of broken into like this is the part about the school, and this is the part about rescuing the kids, and this is the part with Mike Tyson, and then and this is the part with Wing Sing dying, and this is the part with this, and there is a through line there. Chung Tin Chi ends up being the through line for the movie.
Hmm.
I didn't mind it, and in fact, I think that it was pretty successful because I thought each little episode was really successful. It was interesting to see the episodes in this larger structure.
And considering that the movie is something like 100 minutes long, it's, a little more than an hour and a half. And when you've got these four or more distinct parts, it really is. I can see what you mean when you say episodic. It becomes almost like you're watching several episodes of a TV series.
Right.
I think this is also getting to what you were saying, or what we were both saying, about how the movie sort of drops threads. We
Hmm.
have this part with the school at the beginning, and we're introduced to Ip Ching's teacher, who's this young woman who's just trying her best to teach the kids. And then we also are introduced to Ip Man's sort of first or first student, I guess you would say,
Hmm.
and the student and the teacher have this little meet cute moment where he's guarding outside the school one night, and she comes out ready to go home, and he's like, oh hey, do you need somebody to walk you home? Do you have a boyfriend? Do you want a boyfriend?
I'm
And
a
she's
real
like,
dork.
I've
Yeah, yeah,
never thought about it.
yeah.
But yeah, then it doesn't go anywhere.
It doesn't go right. There's no that love story or potential love story doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, like I think the last time we see that student character at all is when Ip Ching is kidnapped and he goes to tell Wing Sing. And I'm trying to think
No,
afterward.
I think we see him at the challenge, the
Yes.
scheduled challenge that Ip Man doesn't actually appear at.
But he stops being a force in the narrative
Mm-hmm.
really early on. And then he's got this little stinger moment toward the end. And the teacher is more or less the same way. We get introduced to so many characters who just disappear eventually, and we don't see how they resolve, or we don't see what kind of consequences come from their departure or anything like that.
Each episode does kind of set up the next one. So there's the challenge at the school, and the Sergeant Poe, is sort of powerless to do anything about it
Mm-hmm.
until Ip Man gives him the sort of thematic speech of the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's full of Confucianism and
Yeah.
yeah.
And then of course that ends up coming into play into the next episode when the kids get kidnapped, and then Sergeant Poe can come in and be the hero at the end, which is good. I like that guy. He's kind of a lovable dump.
Yeah, and I'm glad that in the subtitles this time around we were given his rank so that we could call him Sergeant Poe instead of constantly making fun of his weight. Like,
Oh yeah, they did it a couple of times, but yeah.
right. And I was like, okay, cool. So, like, in this movie, I guess you're establishing, remember, this is the character we made fun of last time, but he has a new name now. If he's in the fourth one, I hope they don't make any reference at all to
Man, I
his
hope that
little
guy
nickname.
retires. He's too old.
It's true. It's true. You know what, though? I was going to say this whole situation with the police being in control of the West and being corrupt and ineffectual, this is tried and true wuxia genre theming that we've seen throughout all sorts of stuff.
Oh, I was having the same thoughts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it made me think specifically of Iron Monkey with Chief Fox.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some real similarities between these two characters in the sense that they're hard pressed but golden hearted officers of the law who are trying to do right in a system that just resists their efforts at every step.
Yeah, I thought this one was the most wuxia out of the three Ip Man movies that we've watched so far.
I agree. And it made me think about how in the first movie we talked a lot about how Foshan is this clear Jianghu where we've got all these
Mm-hmm.
rival schools and everything. And that element of wuxia has been carried through all three of the movies so far. But I agree. This one with the schoolyard fight where they're bragging about their styles
Mm-hmm.
and just every moment I was like, "Oh yeah, wuxia. Check, check, check." It's a really good example of it.
Yeah, yeah, it's nice because there's definitely we had the ineffectual governmental control, and we had the substrata of the different martial schools,
Mhm.
and then we have sort of a more sinister element there with Frank and Sang and all of them.
Yeah.
And yeah, it really, and then just the ranking. The ranking was the big through line of the whole thing, with Chung Tin Chi wanting to become the Grandmaster of Wing Chun.
I agree. And it's interesting in the ranking system, it seems there's only number one and number two.
Mm-hmm.
There is clearly a thriving martial culture in Hong Kong throughout this film, but it seems like the schools have more or less found an equilibrium. It's
Mm-hmm.
not so much about trying to enter a new scene, even though the rival does that, Ting Chi. We don't see the stakes of that. We just see him tearing through the martial world in that way, because his goal isn't find my place in the martial world. It's unseat Ip Man as the number one guy.
I mean, I think that leads pretty nicely into our next thing,
Hmm.
and that's the how do you challenge someone who's the very best?
Yeah. And how do you do it in a way that's not as threatening? In the first movie, General Miura threatened the entire Chinese way of life. In the second movie, Twister threatens the dignity of the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese people and their reputation. But in this movie, it's more of an internal battle. There is this battle with the West. We still see that colonialism and that nationalism story play out, but it's a story about two rivals who bear each other no violent will. They're just trying to determine which one of them is better.
Right. And I think that you can see that Ip Man would be friends with Tin Chi.
He wants to be.
He
That's the
wants
thing.
to
I
be,
think he
yeah.
can see from the beginning that Tin Chi has got a chip on his shoulder. And Ip Man is just like, oh, yeah, cool. We have similarity. We really are brothers in arms. We come from the same lineage. And
Hmm.
Tin Chi's like, nah, I don't think so.
Yeah, everything that has happened before the story starts sets Tin Chi on this path.
Right.
You see him violate the themes that Ip Man brings up to Sergeant Poe
Hmm.
in order to achieve the success that he does.
Yeah. He's clearly coded as not as virtuous as Ip Man.
Because his desires are so strong, he ends up taking money from Song to beat up the other master. That's his moment where you're like, oh, Tin Chi, I liked you.
It reminds me a little bit of Jade City with Barrow. And you know me, I'm such a fool for a good class politics story. And we have this basically noble coming from an established family, even if he fell on hard times for a while, but this
Mm-hmm.
basically noble reigning champ, Ip Man, who's perfectly virtuous and undefeatable in combat, who encounters this scrappy, poor rickshaw driver of a master who lives a very different life by circumstance and is forced into a lot of different and harder and bad choices because of that life.
Yeah, he's a really sympathetic character, and he has an actual arc in the movie, whereas Ip Man an iconic character. He solves all of his problems by being more Ip Man,
Right.
right? Whereas Tin Chi has to fight and scrape and challenge his beliefs and fail and turn around and then do something good, and so it was an interesting sort of juxtaposition of these two Wing Chun masters and how they approach the world.
Yeah, I want to sort of explore the relationship between Ting Chi and Ip Man with you and talk about how that sort of defines Ting Chi's arc. But really quickly, I want to make a point. You had mentioned that Ip Man's solution is to always become more Ip Man. The
Hmm.
more Ip Man you can become, the better you will be able to overcome your obstacles, right? And that reminds me of Superman, which is something that we've discussed before on the show, especially in the context of Ip Man. And I just want to say that there's a great video about this on YouTube on a channel called Accented Cinema. Check out Ip Man How to Write Superman. And this movie, especially, really hammered it home for me. Just seeing Ip Man really is at the top of his game. It doesn't seem like he's ever going to not be at the top of his game. He's constantly taking on every challenger. We're always upping the ante. In the first one, he fought 10 people. In the second one, in the fish market fight, he fought 20. In this one, in the industrial yard fight, he fights
100.
5 million or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, it's just
Right.
so many people. Yeah, and so the way that Ip Man faces challenges is to always make it more personal and to always make it a problem that his martial arts can't solve. And I think the ultimate fulfillment of that comes in this film with Wing Sing's cancer.
Right. And she ends up having to tell him to go back and be at Mon again.
Right,
I mean,
right.
that's one of the things that's made him kind of a bad husband through the movie series, is that Ip Man is a martial person and he loves to fight. That's where his artistry, that's where his core is. And they spend all this time together and it's great, but she knows that he'll never be truly happy until he answers the challenge from Tin Chi, and that he can't be himself in in that way. So it's a little self-sacrificing on Wing Sing's. I wish she had a more dynamic role in the movie, but she has to remind him, like, yes, I'm dying. Yes, this thing is happening, but you have to be true to yourself.
Right. Well, and like you say, Ip Man is a martial character. But the other side of Ip Man's coin is that he is a mouthpiece for Chinese values and
Mm-hmm.
often also for Chinese nationalism, specifically for that.
Right.
And what we see here is that he is a martial character and he craves that martial world in his own sort of chaste way, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
He has a relationship of courtly love with the martial world. But when Wing Sing is diagnosed with cancer and when it becomes clear that this is the beginning of the end for her, we get a chance to see Ip Man fully fulfill that Chinese value system that he's always trying to embody in the martial world. And it's almost like we see by stepping away from the martial world, that is how he fully embraces and embodies the value system that he is the mouthpiece for.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's, we get this extra challenge, not out of left field, but with Wing Sing's illness that he can't fight his way out of. So how does he adapt to it? What is he willing to give up? Because yeah, we see him fight everybody and win. So how do we see that the very first step is the challenge to his marriage with him being out all night guarding the school.
Yeah.
And then and that he still chooses the martial life. And then eventually that challenge becomes so much stronger when she gets ill that he realizes that there's like a part of this life that he's been neglecting. Like yes, he loves martial arts, but he also loves his family. And that's the thing that that's the thing that he has to be reminded of in this movie.
It's interesting that you say that him defending the school is the martial, like him indulging his martial side. And I think that there's another layer that we can put on top of that. I think he's indulging his martial side there because he sees it as a way to support his family. It's his son's school. And
Right.
so by defending it, he's like, oh, well, I can do both worlds, right? But we get these constant reminders that no, when you're there defending the school, yeah, you're defending your son's ability to get an education here, but you're also ignoring your son at home and your wife and the
Mm,
life that you have built there.
right. And you're also using your school in a way that is not what it's for. Like
Right.
there's definitely some chatter about that in the movie
Hmm.
that the students are being like, people are saying that we're just a security agency now.
That was an interesting subversion to me too, because a lot of the time in wuxia films, the more historical ones especially, a lot of Shaw kind of aspire to be a
Hmm.
security company. And in this one, it's like, no, 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 that's not the role of Shaw anymore.
Right. That our job is just to be like pure and noble and live our chaste lifestyle here.
Right.
But yeah.
Examples of fitness and culture, and
Hmm.
only sort of disruptive or violent internally.
Man, that's a lot of layers in this movie, surprisingly, considering that it's a
Yeah.
a reasonably simple movie.
Right, right. We kind of got sidetracked here talking about Ip Man and Wing Sing and everybody. I
Yeah.
really want to talk though about Chung Tin Chi and his rise through the ranks and his encounters with Ip Man, because I see every single moment between Ip Man and Chung Tin Chi as an opportunity for them to learn something about each other.
Hmm.
And it's a perfect rival arc for Chung Tin Chi, I think, that culminates in this final battle, but it does it in such a cool way that I don't think we've seen in the series so far.
No, I think that we're seeing someone that in another life could have been Ip Man.
Yeah.
And if he had been in Foshan in the first movie, then maybe they could have been that friendly rivalry.
Hmm.
But we see that his desire to lift himself up, to not be a laborer or worker anymore, is so strong that class part of it pushes on the martial part. And really is interesting because you see Ip Man reaching out to Tin Chi to become friends and to understand each other and Tin-Chi is like, no, I don't have what you have. I can't make these decisions. And so it leads him to do some unscrupulous stuff. But then he gets to be redeemed. He has this really like up and down arc.
Hmm.
Whereas like, he keeps buffering up and down against sort of Ip Man and his reputation. So when he has his heel turn where he takes money from Song and he goes and he beats up the old master. But then he has his face turn when he's like, you know what, screw this. I'm sick of taking orders from Song. They kidnapped my kid. I'm not going to be a bad guy. And then he runs into the reputation where Ip Man gets to beat up 400 guys and go home, and he gets arrested.
Yeah.
And we don't see what happens, but we can just assume that, he's a nobody. And so he doesn't get the special treatment that Ip Man gets.
Right. And we see, in the second movie, we see that the old northern stylist, Cam,
Mm-hmm.
he ends up in prison with Ip Man and they help each other get out. They support each other after that. In this movie, we see that this guy that Ip Man is interested in building a relationship with, even if he's not actively trying, it's clear that he is cool with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't show up for that dude, doesn't help him get out of trouble. He just goes home with his kid and greets his wife.
Yeah, and I mean it's sort of a thread that's dropped, but it really stuck out to me in its absence. I'm like, oh, nobody's gonna help Tin-Chi get out of this after he rescued all of these people.
Yeah, he had a face turn.
Yeah,
Come on. And I will say that he carries the heel act with him after that face turn too,
right,
because the duels that we mentioned with the different masters are all fueled by this sort of disdain. It's almost like he's saying, I know you're not worth my time. You are only a means to an end. I will fight Ip Man, and you are the path to get me there. So I'm just going to wrap this up as quickly as I can.
right. He just picks a fight essentially in the tea house where all of the masters hang out
Right. He
in
goes
order to
to
get
the
the whole
reporter.
process start. Yeah.
Yeah, he goes to the reporter and he's like, hey, can you write an article about me and challenge Ip Man to a fight? And the guy's like, well, who are you? You have to make yourself known. And he's like, okay, cool. Hold on a second. Let me go challenge this guy over here.
And we see him beat up a couple of the masters that we had sort of lovable relationships with in Hitman 2.
Yeah, right, right. I think the first one is the monkey stylist.
Right. And he doesn't need to get kicked in the head. He's old.
Yeah, come on. He's already got that tick or something.
Right. He's got his monkey tick.
Leave his head alone. Yeah, no, but I want to say, so every scene that we see between Tin-Chi and Ip Man, there's the first one where their kids are in a fight. Ip Man and his wife take the other boy home with them to give him dinner because it's clear that he's hungry. He tries to steal some food from a desk. And so they feed him. The Chung Tin-Chi, the dad, shows up. They have a very brief introduction and they get this little teaser. Oh, hey, we both study Wing Chun. How interesting, right? Oh, cool. Well, file that away. Next meeting they have, Chung Tin-Chi's like, oh, hey, your Wing Chun school. I heard we have the same master or grandmaster from a couple generations back. Oh yeah, I do. Hey, Ip Man's like, we're really brothers in arms then. And Chung Tin-Chi is like, well, I hear that your direct master was stronger with these weapons than with these weapons. Is that true? And just this naked sort of like, I hear your master isn't perfect. What do you have to say about that, Ip Man?
Oh. Yeah, definitely. And that ends up coming out in the final fight.
Yeah, because they go through all of those weapons.
Right.
And I think the very next scene between the two of them is actually when Song's gang attacks the school and the two of them show up to fight him off, and from a distance they both get a chance to observe each other's style. And I
Right.
saw that and I was like, oh boy, perfect rival scene right here. They're both showing off their stuff against a bunch of people. They're both performing admirably, but they have distinctly different variations on the Wing Chun style. Very cool scene.
Right. And also at the end of that scene, Tin-Chi he has to go back to work.
Yeah.
He just picks up his rickshaw and he leaves.
Yeah, he doesn't. I mean, he has a son, but he calls his son his disciple, and his son calls him master. he doesn't really have a family to go home to in the same way that Ip Man does.
Yeah, I really liked all of their interactions, and it's interesting to have that dramatic relationship of Tin Chi butt up against the iconic relationship of Ip Man, and then we finally see Tin Chi learn the lesson at the end of the movie.
Yeah. I was going to say really quickly, it's interesting that in a series where Ip Man is the hero, but Ip Man can't change.
Mm-hmm.
And so Wing Chun is also a protagonist of the story. And we're
Mm,
constantly wondering if Wing Chun can overcome whatever obstacle is placed in front of it. We finally get a look into okay, Ip Man doesn't change and won't leave the top spot. Can Wing Chun beat Ip Man?
sure,
and
yeah.
and we find out, well, not really. Wing Chun beats Wing Chun in this case.
Well, it Wing Chun versus Wing Chun is equal, but purity of heart and values beats unscrupulousness.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't know if it is actually unscrupulous, but it does strike me as a little coded that way in the final fight, because the major difference that I see between Tinchi and Ip Man's style of Wing Chun is that Ting Chi's seems to be more open-handed. And I know you had noticed a difference as well. I can't remember what it was you said.
So, Ip Man's style is very circular. You know, he's constantly moving his feet and his hands in circular motions. Like
Hmm.
they're both clearly practicing Wing Chun, but Tin Chi's is much more straight lines and much more forceful.
Yeah. And
And he
I
uses a
think,
lot of kicks.
yeah, there are a couple of moments. I think the kicks is what makes me think this, but there are a couple of moments throughout the movie where I think to myself, oh, it looks like Tinchi's is maybe a little more formal and Ip
Hmm.
Man's is a little more unorthodox in the sense that it seems to draw a lot of inspiration from the opponents that he's faced in previous movies,
Mm.
karate, Western boxing, etc. And he seems to be comfortable sort of adding some of those lessons into his own style.
Hmm.
Whereas Ting Chi strikes me, there are a lot of really set poses that show up, and the long kicks and everything make me wonder if it's more of a traditional form of Wing Chun or something like that.
But the part that where Ting Chi loses the end fight is where he pokes Ip Man in the eye.
Yeah.
We see that fight from when he was fighting in the underground fighting rings, where he
Hmm.
uses that move, and that's the point where he loses the fight.
Right. And that's what you're saying, like kind of an unscrupulous thing to do, right?
Right.
And the way that Ip Man prevails, interestingly, is the 1 inch punch that Bruce Lee is famous for. And Ip
Right.
Man taught him that, but we get that teaser that, oh, this is the real hidden power of Ip Man's specific variation of Wing Chun.
And he's able to keep his equanimity. Even though he can't see, he's able to avoid all of those blows until he recovers enough and gets in close enough to deliver that final pure strike.
Right. And he can't do it unless he's really up against the wall
Right.
too. He's lost his clear vision.
Hmm.
He's clearly up against the ropes, and the only thing that he can do is this last desperate gambit to bring the fight. And it's really the first solid moment of violence in this fight too. They're trading
Hmm.
blows back and forth the whole time. They're destroying bits of the scenery, whatever. But this is the first time that one of them is really hurt by a blow that the other one gives.
So at the end, you know, Tin Chi is defeated by Ip Man because of his unscrupulous nature. It sort of sets him up for that final blow. And then because he is broken down, that Ip Man is finally like penetrated Tin Chi's shell that he's built up because of,
Yeah.
you know, his constantly after fighting. That's when he gives the message of like the most important thing is to be with the ones that you love.
Hmm.
And then he leaves with his wife, and you know, that's essentially the end of the movie.
Right. And the real battle for Ip Man is always the ideological battle.
Hmm.
but there are all of these violent walls up around the people that he's trying to get through to. And so he has to prove that he is the superior fighter in order for them to be receptive to that message that's going to make them a better person.
I think we've got a perfect segue to move into some at the table stuff,
Yeah, let's do it.
because we're talking about dynamically changing the fight stakes. And we talk about the fight with Tinchi and Ip Man, where they start with poles and then they go with the butterfly knives. And they're essentially evenly matched in both of those. I mean, it's not
Hmm.
until they're both they're both unarmed, they're both just fighting with hands and feet, that they are finally like close enough physically to that they are close enough emotionally in order to make that change, that Ip Man is able to convey that information to break down Tinchi's barriers. And
Yeah. We know, I mean, it's well established in all sorts of role playing games that increased stakes mean increased vulnerability. You expose yourself to greater risk of harm when you increase the stakes. But something that we see in this fight too is that closeness is a model of raising stakes as well. That's a little bit more symbolic, but they start off with these long range pole weapons, and then they move to what you would call mid range butterfly knives, and then they're in close range hand to hand fighting. And those, from a cinematic perspective, you get closer and closer shots every time because when you're fighting with these big poles, you have to be back to be able to see all the action. By the time you're hand to hand, it's like, no, you can get your faces 2 inches from each other. You can get as close and as violent
but
and
I
gritty
think
as you want.
it harkens back to some points that we made earlier, that you are in the most danger and the stakes are the highest when you are hand to hand, because you are the most laid
Yeah.
bare. And ironically, you are in the most danger, despite the fact that, especially in like role playing context, we think of like, oh, well, the person with a weapon that does more damage is the one who, has the advantage. The other person is in more danger. And in this one, it's because
Yeah.
the stakes have been raised high enough that we can go that both players are willing to go hand to hand, means that they are so close to each other that that's when the real damage can be done. And in this case, it wasn't about killing each other, because like you said earlier, this movie's Ip Man 3 is not about murdering people with your fists. It's more about
Hmm.
teaching lessons and or achieving an accord, like in the fight with Mike Tyson. um and
Hmm.
that's when we know that like things can get done, is when people are fighting hand to hand. They are the most intimate, they are the most open, they are the most vulnerable, and that's when we know the action is really like tense and dramatic.
Yeah. And in some RPGs, the notion is whichever weapon is strongest is how you're going to know who's in more danger. And a lot of RPGs live and die that way. But watching all this wuxia media and like Hong Kong action media and stuff, wow, it just doesn't seem like the best way to approach it anymore, does it?
No, it
it's,
really doesn't.
it's like, no, I mean, when you can model stakes and threats that have nothing to do with how sharp your sword is, sign me up.
Yep, because it doesn't matter what weapon you. I mean, if you can kill somebody with your hands, and you could also kill somebody with a stick, like it kind of doesn't matter whether you use the stick or your hands.
That's the lesson Hero teaches us, right? The
Right,
the ultimate ideal of the swordsman is when the sword disappears altogether.
right. And I think that along with movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, the training room fight, and this last fight scene, I mean, I think they're really masterclasses in that. Like, I am trying to tell you a thing, and no, I am trying to resist learning that thing. And the change in weapons is the tempo and the tactic change of that conversation.
Yeah. And I will say the class dynamics of what's happening are fraught. We set up a situation where we see that Tinchi is the way he is because of his circumstances. He is driven to desperation and to do these things. And Ip Man's trying to teach him a lesson. And we've seen that Ip Man has faced poverty himself more than once, but he always
Hmm.
seems to rise to a place of comfort. And the ideology that he's trying to impress on Tinchi is sort of a bootstrap ideology. He doesn't go right out and say, if you do this, your life will prosper. But he is saying, like, this is the way that's worth living. It's sort of a virtue ethics bootstrapping mentality. And there's
Right,
plenty to
right.
take issue with there. Like, is it possible for Tinchi to learn this lesson, or are his circumstances going to drive him back into a situation where he's forced to make hard or bad choices again?
Hmm.
And the movie doesn't really answer that question. And I think that's a weakness of the movie, but I also think that that was in no way the agenda of the filmmakers.
No, because it's Ip Man's
Right.
movie. It's not Tinchi's
Right, right.
movie.
I do hope
I mean, I
though.
would love to see like the next one that like Chung Tinchi and like what happens to him
That's
next.
exactly what I was
Because
going to say. I really want him to be a part of the next movie too, because I don't want to
mhm,
be done with his story.
no, he's super interesting. He's very handsome,
Oh wow! And
and
that outfit, man, the
oh
Henley shirt
man,
and the vest and the tucked in scarf. Boy, oh boy, buddy, you're looking sharp
yeah,
out there on
yeah,
those streets.
right. So let's get back on
Oh yeah,
track,
sorry. This has
and
been your
that's all right. We got
this has
distracted
been
by
your
how handsome he was.
Jongjin appreciation hour.
But talking about like changing stakes in the movie, we can go back to the industrial yard fight where the children have been kidnapped, and it really like that one also escalates in sort of multiple different directions. It escalates in the the stakes of the fight and also in the like the fight pressure,
Yeah.
I guess is what I will say.
Yeah. And I kind of see an interesting arc there. I think the greatest danger that Ip Ching is in is when he's in Song's hands and Song's got the knife basically right in front of his
Hmm.
face, right? And by the time Ip Man rescues Ip Ching and they're in the room with the stick battle, climbing up on the scaffolding and all that stuff, you get the sense that, like, okay, cool, well, the greatest danger has passed and now it's more of an endurance battle, but there are still
Hmm.
marked stake changes throughout that fight.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the scenes have different aims. And so when in the industrial yard fight we get the real like tense we get the tense moment of Ching in Song's hands with the knife and the apple and all of that kind of stuff. And then as it goes along we get little moments of danger, but it's a lot of it is how is Ip Man going to flex on this scene?
Right, right.
Um
What cool thing are we
and
going to see now?
exactly, exactly. And at that point, Song leaves the narrative. Once that threat of him killing Ching essentially is no longer a part of it. He literally crawls out of a window out of the movie.
Right. Well, there's the final scene that he's in back in the fighting ring where he's sort of interviewing the Muay Thai fighter, and
Mm-hmm.
he tells Frank, he's like, hey, yeah, this guy's great. He's got kicks and elbows and punches and knees and all sorts of the good stuff, right? And
Right,
then
right.
Frank is like, no, 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 I'm going to punch you for a little while because you've made me mad. You've prevented me from playing with my toys and you're going to suffer for that. And then he's like, get out of my face. I don't ever want to see you again. And that's the end of Song. So long, buddy.
Yep. Yep. So in the industrial yard fight, we have we have the tension of the scene change with the stakes, but we have the scene continue even when the stakes are lowered because the purpose of the scene has changed.
Yeah.
It has changed from get Ching back to like hold out, do some interesting stuff, flex on the
Yeah.
scene until Poe comes
Right.
in.
If I had to identify all three of the stakes that Ching faces, or that Ip Man and Ching face together, it's like Ip Ching is in immediate danger. He's in the clutches of the enemy. He's got a knife pulled on him. then Ip Man frees Ip Ching from that situation. All of a sudden, Ip Ching is in the melee, and Ip Man has to protect him from that melee. That's a little less
Mm-hmm.
dangerous because he's out of the clutches of the big bad, but he's still in danger. And so then Ip Man's next task, well, let's get him out of danger. Climb up this scaffolding. Well, it's dangerous up on scaffolding, so you're not out of danger yet. You're just no longer in the melee. And then people still come up to try and get you. And another thing that made me think this is the most wuxia movie so far, this is the one moment in the entire series where we've gotten a glimpse of light body skill.
Oh yeah.
They're the two goons who are up on the scaffolding and they're trying to spook Ip Ching, and then Ip Man just runs straight up the scaffolding and smacks both of them in the legs to knock them down. And I was like, light body skill, there we go.
Right.
Fill out your bingo cards, folks.
I just assume that that's a thing that Donnie Yen can do. So I didn't even
Oh
notice.
yeah, no, he doesn't use wire work at all in this movie. That's a 100% true fact.
True TM, true fact. So while we're talking about this, I think it's an interesting time to talk about dynamically changing your fight locations along with your stakes. If we use a role-playing game, there are definitely like zones where like different things happen. You know, there's the cage where the kids are kept up high in the yard, and that's one zone, and that's big high stakes, kind of low danger for Ip Man, but high danger for Ip Ching.
Right. Well, and notably, that scene is the scene where Ip Man's got his long pole as well. So the stakes are physically about as distant as they can get, as well as being risk wise relatively low.
Right. And then we see then the scene changes to Ip Man in the boat construction. They're in the like belly of the boat.
Oh, yeah. And the rules of this part of the fight are interesting because Song has said, for every blow you land, I will feed your son a piece of apple. And so Ip Man's like, okay, how do I win this fight without hitting anyone?
Mm-hmm. And so a lot of it is getting away, is manipulating the other people into colliding with each other. And he's got this whole gang of like sort of elite level mooks.
Yeah.
You could tell they're elite because they all have the same uniform on. And they do land some blows. That's the other thing that happens, is that because Ip Man is restricted, they do actually get some hits on him.
And then Ting Chi shows up and sort of frees the kids from the cage and gives Ip Man the chance to get legit violent with these goons.
Right. And then they go into the warehouse. So every time the conceit of the fight changes, they change location. And they don't necessarily worry about like watching a character run from one location to another. It does happen a little bit, but a lot of it is just like, okay, well, now we're in this interesting fight scene.
Right. We get like an establishing shot of them bursting into this new space, but we don't necessarily see the full transit.
Right. So because we're going, okay, well, we've got new stakes now, so time for a new interesting thing. And you could see like a little negotiation between like a players and GM going like, okay, we're going to change the stakes now. Okay, well, what does this scene have in it? Does somebody want to describe sort of the general outline of the scene? Does somebody want to say like what's advantageous for one side? Does somebody want to say what's advantageous for the other side? What's it, and really negotiate and create these interesting fight locations that represent what the scene's about.
Yeah. I want to sort of lay out the pieces here and then work this back from the end. So we know that there are scenes, fight scenes. We know that there are locations within these fight scenes, and we know that stakes change when you go from location to location. We need to talk about what is the trigger for the stakes and the scene changing, and how do you work toward that. I think the trigger is the achievement of a goal of some kind, or at least sometimes, maybe not all the time. But Ip Ching and Chung Tin-Chi's kid get freed. Okay, cool. Stakes have changed. Scene should change. What are some other ways that the scene and or stakes change, and how do we model that as like an arc?
I think that every time that a goal is achieved on either side, that's a good place to think about changing scenes. The other time is if there's like a very dramatic high or a very dramatic low, that's probably also a good time to change scenes. So we have a really low moment where Ipman is forced to bow down and pay respect to Song, and then that fight happens, and that's when we switch scenes.
Yeah, it's not like Tinchi knows that Ip Man has had to do this, but nonetheless, it seems like when Ip Man has to bow, it is the trigger for Tinchi to turn around and come into the scene as a fighter.
Well, I think Tinchi does see it, and then his son says, but what about all of my friends?
Ah, yeah.
And that's the moment where Tinchi comes back and re-enters sort of the first zone, while Ipmon's in the second zone fighting in the ship. And then um, we see, um, we get to see Tinchi's sort of like big face turn
Hmm.
again, and then he gets to be successful in that scene. So that scene's basically over. So he frees Ip Ching, and then that sort of unlocks the next scene where Ip Man can go into the warehouse with Ip Ching. Well, I guess Song has him, but he goes in there and does sort of the last scene, and the last scene is hold out until help arrives.
Yeah. So then, would it be fair to summarize and say that major achievements and major setbacks or concessions are the two main triggers for when stakes and scenery have to change?
I think that's the most interesting time. The other time is to go, oh, well, this scene is boring. We've done everything in this
Right.
scene.
We've had our chance to show off here. Let's.
Right. Let's move on. Like there's only so much we can do in this scene. So the other thing is go, okay, well, there are these stairs, there's this cage, there's this open space. We have used all of those things. Let's move to a new scene.
Yeah. It reminds me of the notion that clocks don't necessarily model difficulty best.
Hmm.
They might be better at modeling what is interesting. And maybe if you're going to have a clock in a role playing game, you don't really need to put one on the table unless everybody's like, "Oh yeah, cool. No, let's explore this moment in detail."
Hmm.
But even then, you kind of
Yeah.
shouldn't be beholden to, okay, if we put this clock on a table, we are going to fill it up before we move on. Because if you get three-quarters of the way through a clock and you're like, oh, okay, it's starting to feel a little samey, a little repetitive, whatever. Okay, fine. Well, scrap the clock and we'll move to a new thing. You can escalate the stakes to get rid of the clock and find a new reason to be fighting.
Right. You almost want to have like a series of checkboxes around the table, like tied to various features of the scene, and go like, okay, well, when you're done with this, check the box.
Hmm.
And then any player can do that. And then when all the boxes are checked, that's we move on because at least one person is no longer invested in what's happening in each spot in this scene.
Yeah, and that makes me wonder because I think it's plain to say that you can change stakes and locations even if you don't check all of those boxes. But what does
Hmm.
that say in the context of the game? Is that the concession or the setback modeled? It's like, okay, well, we had these four goals, we checked three of them, but then something really bad happened, and we're going to have to switch gears and address this thing more directly and basically abandon the rest of our checklist.
Right. And what kind of consequences does that carry forward?
Yeah, yeah. I like that. And I'm trying to tie this in also. Maybe the industrial fight is not a perfect example, but maybe looking at the movie as a whole, we can see that theme of stakes making things more intimate, right? We've got the fight in the industrial yard with Ip Man outdoors protecting his son. And because he's a child, personally, I didn't really feel that he was going to be put in any serious danger. It was all going to be threats.
Hmm.
It just didn't seem to me like the type of movie where they would actually hurt a child, right?
No, and Song seemed like too much of a coward to just murder a
Right. He
child.
was really blustering. And so I never really felt, I thought it was effective, but I never felt genuine concern for what was going to happen to this kid. It was very much a situation like, well, how's Ip Man going to get out of this one? But then you look at the next fight, the elevator fight with the Muay Thai fighter and Wing Sing right there. His
Hmm.
wife is ill. She is in pain. She is dying. He is trying to savor his last months with her. And then the martial world intrudes in this really confined space. And she's an adult. That felt to me like much more serious stakes.
Right. So then the first scene, the goal is to, he's got two goals. He's got protect Wing Sing and get this Muay Thai fighter out of the elevator.
Yeah. Put an end to his threat.
Right. And then once he is able to do that, he is able to focus on actually fighting the the Muay Thai fighter.
Yeah. And like you said before the recording, pretty awesome that Ip Man is even more powerful than an early 2000s vampire.
I just think there's a movie out there for that actor being a Muay Thai vampire.
I got to say, too, though, I got to do a quick aside here. We're talking about stakes, and I want to stay focused on that. This elevator fight scene,
Oh, it's so good.
it's so good. And from a strictly martial arts perspective, there's a shot where they're going down the stairs and they have an overhead camera that shows the two of them from up above. Pay
Oh,
attention to Ip Man's feet first, but like watch this scene of watch this shot, I should say, a few times. We always talk about how fast Donnie Yen's hands are and how Ip Man's Wing Chun hands are just super fast, like he can punch, rapid fire, whatever. He's blocking 10 things at once. The true sign of an accomplished martial artist is good footwork. And I have maybe never seen better footwork in a film than what I saw in this shot.
and the shots are so long
Oh,
as well
yeah.
that like you can really savor them. Like I remember watching the scene going like, these are long
Really
shots.
long, like 5 to 10 seconds long. It's really impressive.
Well, and talk about like an intimate set of stakes. Putting two fighters into an elevator
Oh, with
is
someone else
like
to protect.
with someone else to protect is I love close combat fighting. I love it when you just cram people into a tiny
Yeah,
space
a real
and you
iconic moment from that elevator scene is when the TIE fighter kicks Ip Man backwards. And normally Ip Man would just be able to like, okay, my back hits the wall and I'm still fighting. But no,
right.
Wing Sing is behind him. So he has to throw his arms out, totally dropping his guard to make sure that he doesn't hurt his wife by flying backwards. Oh,
Yeah, that one's really good. And then when he finally gets the Muay Thai fighter out of the elevator, you can see what's at stake change.
yeah. Can we talk for a second about the symbolism of them leaving the elevator too? Wing Sing has always felt exposed to unnecessary danger in this film series. And in this elevator, she is in the middle of unnecessary danger. And then, just like Ip Man does all the time, he saves her, he moves away from her, and he puts an iron wall between the two of them. I could not
Well,
believe the beauty of that symbolism.
and then he fights the guy all the way down the stairs
And meets her
and then
downstairs.
meets you downstairs when the elevator opens. It was very cute.
It's so good. It's so good. And the relief on her face when she sees, like, he's okay again. Yet
Right.
again, he has come out more or less unscathed. Oh, it's a good scene.
It's a good scene.
It's a real good
Um,
scene. What I was going to say, though, it's interesting that both in the industrial yard fight and in the elevator fight, I have had the thought, oh, these are kind of reverse stakes. They start off at their most dire, and then they
mhm,
become pretty quickly a story of like, let's watch Ip Man show off as the danger gets less and less and less. And
mhm.
so it's almost like fight for fight. Each individual fight starts at peak stakes and tapers off until the end. But the narrative as a whole does a pretty good job of ramping up the stakes more and more as you go through. The school's threatened. Oh no, it's the kid who's threatened. Oh no, it's his wife's life that is guaranteed to end prematurely. And then it's like, oh no, his entire reputation in the martial world is at stake now. It does a really good job of keeping those escalating stakes, despite the fact that all the individual fights seem to work in the opposite way.
That's interesting because it reminds me of what you were talking about earlier, comparing him to Superman. We're not going to see Superman lose a fight.
No.
Like, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is to see that kind of character confront those pressures and to see what they do. And I think once we see them make the right choice, the right choice is getting the Muay Thai fighter out of the elevator. The right choice is finally challenging Tin Chi. The right choice is confronting Frank and having it out. From there, we can see that character be themselves. And it helps that it's Donnie Yen and it's Ip Man and the fight choreography is awesome, right? But it's more about like the entrance into that conversation of a fight than it is about like the resolution.
Yeah. We've talked before about how in a lot of wuxia films, violence is a pressure release valve.
Mm-hmm.
And the important part of a wuxia story or of a Hong Kong action story is about the narrative pressure that builds up from these constrained choices and these open questions of will they make the right choice? Will they fulfill their value system or what have you? And then it sounds almost strange to say it, but it's like a fight happens and you're like, okay, cool. Tension resolved. We can relax as we watch this beat 'em up scene.
Right.
Which
We can just enjoy the violence and the resolution. It's the resolution on the tension, and so yeah, we can just enjoy it.
right. And I think there
That's
are
so interesting.
certainly a lot of fights across wuxia media that have real threats and real stakes in the violence itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Ip Man is a series that does a good job of showing that even if the fights are thrilling and intense, they're not the most important part of the story.
Hmm.
They're sort of a part, they're an important part of the story's vehicle, but the more important part is the constraints that are placed on the characters and the pressure that builds up that fights release.
Man, that's a good point.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, we're just synthesizing a lot of previous lessons at this point. We're on episode 34,
Right,
We've talked a
right.
lot about this stuff.
Since we've learned that the only way to defeat Wing Chun is more Wing Chun, and so that the only thing that we can do now is to remember to make our kung fu stronger. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Jianghu Hustle is being released on Misdirected Mark Productions, the media arm of Encoded Designs.
If you're enjoying the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Jianghu Hustle. You can reach Eli at ZapDynamic on Twitter or on his website, mythicgazetteer.com. You can reach me at Eric M. Farmer on Twitter or at my website, dogpoweredvehicle.com. You can reach both of us at Jianghu Hustle on Twitter or jianghuhustle@gmail.com or on the Misdirected Mark website. Thanks for listening.